there hadn't really been a high-level assassination like this, or certainly not as high level as Heydrich.
Do you think it was worth it? And do you think conclusions about whether it's worth it are useful or just a kind of exercise in unreasonable hindsight? What do you think? Hello, Roger, and welcome back to another exciting episode of the History Book Buffs. And in this outing, we are talking about an event that happened on this day in 1942. Now, it's not necessarily a sad event, is it, Roger
It's
Morehouse?
quite a happy
Tell
one,
us what
really.
it is.
It's the death of Reinhard Heydrich, who was, of course, effectively Himmler's number 2 in the SS. He was assassinated by Czech squad of SOE men sent in by the British. The attack had taken place the previous week, and he succumbed on this day, 1942, to his injuries. So we're going to be talking about that and about the aftermath, the hideous aftermath to his assassination, and where it left things like the Czech resistance and the whole concept of high-level assassinations altogether.
Amazing. And then, of course, this being the book buffs, we're going to talk about some of the best books if people want to read further into this subject. So let's start with the man himself. Monstrous, Roger, I think is the
monstrous, the Butcher of Prague, as he was known, the man with the iron heart. Yeah, he was. He's been sort of, I suppose, immortalised away. If anyone that's seen A Conspiracy, the sort of film of the Wannsee Conference, which has Kenneth Branagh as Heydrich, who actually does a really good job of capturing Heydrich's kind of coldness. He has this sort of
reptilian quality.
It is a little bit. I mean, he is relatively sort of warm, and then there are moments in that where he's sort of, it's almost like he'd fix you with a stare and quite terrifyingly cold. But he was, a bit of an operator, really. He'd been born in 1904, so he missed the First World War. Became a naval cadet in the post-war period. Was then disgraced in the Navy. He promised himself to somebody, and then went off and slept with somebody else.
Hang on, is that enough to disgrace you in the Navy? Isn't that just?
No. Well, you'd think it was par for the course for modern navies, but no, that was enough in the Reichsmarine.
In our Navy, it turns out you have to sleep with the female minister in charge of the Navy. Isn't that now how it works? That's
how it works. Yeah, to actually be disgraced. Yeah. Or not.
Yeah. Well, even then, I'm not sure they've been massively disgraced.
Yeah, but that was enough. He had, like I said, he'd promised himself to someone, and then broke that particular oath, and then that was enough for him to be thrown out of the Navy. So he was a very intelligent man, very capable man who was sort of out on his ear, and fairly swiftly found himself in the SS and in the sort of Nazi Party organisations. His wife, actually, Lena Heydrich, was the kind of fervent Nazi. There's a school of thought that says that, actually Heydrich kind of wasn't particularly ideological. He was just very driven, very ambitious, and she was the one that had all the sort of ideological chops, and she was the one that was driving him along. Anyway, he does very well. He's very, great operator, Machiavellian, very quickly rises within the SS to position basically of Himmler's number 2, is the head of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, which is the security main office, which is basically the organizational body behind the SS, the Gestapo, and everything. He runs that from, the whole security apparatus of the Third Reich. He runs that from 1939 onwards. And then in 1941, he's appointed as what the Germans called Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. And Bohemia and Moravia, I'm sure some of our listeners will know, was basically the 2 provinces that make up the modern Czech Republic, effectively. And so that was, Slovakia, after 1938, Slovakia was independent, and that was a sort of a minor ally of the Germans. And Bohemia and Moravia were basically annexed in 1938 as Czech provinces that were going to be gradually Germanized and sort of exploited and all of that, but they needed to be run. And that exploitation is the key word. So he was put in there basically to be the iron hand behind that occupation regime in the Czech lands, right? So that was why he was then targeted by the Czechs.
Okay, so the Czech resistance that I guess, who are kind of looking to take him out. So it's not just because he's a horrible man who's doing horrible things in his province. It's because they're looking a bit poor compared to other resistance movements, aren't they? Isn't this part of their motivation?
It is. I mean, that assassination team goes in December 41, so it's it's relatively early. It's kind of 6 months before they actually have their opportunity to hit him. But importantly, at that point, you've got the Grand Alliance has already formed. You've got a surreal competition amongst the various sort of resistance regimes and the governments in exile and so on, particularly the Poles. I mean, the Poles are sort of blazing a trail in a lot of this. They're the most effective underground resistance organization. They're the most organized and sort of influential government in exile in London at that time amongst the Allies. So the Czechs are a little bit up against it, right? They have to kind of prove their worth to some extent. And they're worried in a way that the Czech populace is a bit too quiescent, is a bit too quiet and lacking in a sort of a spirit of resistance against the Germans. So the whole point of this operation is effectively to kind of stir up the Czech people in a way. And that means, in effect, that you're wanting to provoke the bear to get a reaction that will then provoke the Czech resistance itself. So not only is it it's a feather in the cap of the Czechs, but it's also, wanting them to be shaken out of that sort of rather quiescent attitude. So it's quite a brutal set of logic going on.
In terms of poking the bear, I mean, we're going to come on to talk about, obviously, the reprisals. In the planning period, when the Czechs are talking about this, and then they kind of go into bed with the Special Operations Executive, which we'll also talk about them in a second. But when they're thinking ahead, presumably they're aware that there will be reprisals. They just consider them A, inevitable, and B, almost desirable in terms of kind of prodding the bear to the point where it kind of stirs people up, and because the bear's reprisals are going to make people understand that they should be resisting.
Yeah, I mean, there hadn't been. I mean, interestingly, there hadn't really been a high-level assassination like this, or certainly not as high level as Heydrich. The Poles assassinate the SS chief of Warsaw, Franz Kuchera, in 1943, so a year later. But at this point in the summer of 1942, there hadn't been a high-level assassination like this. So I think they were actually banking on the logic of the SOE and of the Czech government in exile to a large extent, was that there would be reprisals. Of course there would. But, in a sense, that was the price of fighting for your cause, right? So, in the process, the Czech people would be, shaken out of this rather quiescent attitude. The resistance would get a shot in the arm. They'd in a sense, stop being essentially kind of quasi-German collaborators, which is effectively what the occupation regime was. It was designed to all the heavy industry and all of that in the Bohemian lands, which was quite considerable. All of that was feeding the German war effort, and they wanted that to be disrupted in some way.
So they go in with SOE. Now, according to Halik Kochanski, who will be talking about her brilliant book on resistance at the end, she says that there was also a similar motivation from SOE in the sense that, it was a newish outfit. It was Churchill's special kind of, gang of mischief makers, but it was yet to prove itself either. So you had these two organizations, Czech Resistance and British SOE, both of whom were desperate to do something, headline worthy, big, to justify both their existence and to kind of, spur other people onwards. Is that a fair assessment? Do you think SOE were also behaving kind of, I guess, with one eye on their own?
Yes, I think so.
It's like it's all British government departments, isn't it? Like it's 80% of it, you get the sense they're just justifying their own budget.
Yeah. And I think SOE was, bear in mind, this is always, back sort of 6 months, even more. I mean, the mission only left in December 41. So you've got to go back further than that to find the logic behind it. And I think at that point, I think that's right, that SOE still, effectively had to sort of prove itself within the corridors of power in London as well. So I think that's absolutely logical. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so they get together, they choose the assassins.
So it was Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš. Gabčík was Czech and Kubiš was Slovak. So crucially, as I said before, now Slovakia had been, hived off in 1938 and had been made independent. But I think crucially they chose a Czech and a Slovak as a sort of symbolic, juxtaposition to say that this was a Czechoslovak operation. So the two of them were parachuted in. They'd been through all the SOE training and all of that, all the sort of small arms and the close combat and all of that stuff that they did in various country houses around the UK, and were then parachuted in the depths of winter 1941, 28th of December 1941. The operation was called Operation Anthropoid, which is quite now quite well known as a sort of a title. And they made contact with the Czech resistance. They spent most of that intervening time, working out their plan of attack on Heydrich. A lot of the Czech resistance, incidentally, that they got in touch with were more than a little concerned about the plan to actually hit Heydrich, because they realised that the reprisals were going to be considerable. So there's a lot of misgivings there as well. But they finally do it. They hit him on the 27th of May in the morning. He had to drive in. He had his sort of country house outside Prague, and he had to be driven in with this in a Mercedes with his SS driver, and they found a particular bend in the road in a suburb called Holešovice, where the car had to slow right down. So they thought that was the place to hit him. So you've got Gabčík and Kubiš, one of whom has a Sten gun and the other has a grenade in his backpack. And they sort of one of them steps out in front of the vehicle as it slows down to negotiate this bend, and he's got his Sten gun, levels the Sten gun at the car as it basically grinds to a halt. And of course, as Sten guns tended to do, the gun jammed. So they collectively shit themselves, and that's the technical phrase for it. Heydrich and his driver both sort of leap out of this convertible Mercedes and start, but first of all hurling abuse at them and then trying to shoot at them. And then the guy, I don't know which one it was, whether it's Gabčík or Kubiš, but the other guy is standing by the side of the road with his grenade, and he throws the grenade as they're both sort of, thinking that they've basically messed this up, throws the grenade under the car and explodes basically by the rear wheel of the Mercedes and sends shrapnel up through the seat of the Mercedes, which of course contains horsehair, and sends a piece of shrapnel up into Heydrich's abdomen. So Heydrich is, by this point, standing up. He is wounded and, sort of stumbling a bit, but he's standing up and he's shouting and he's saying, "Get the bastards," and all this sort of thing, and firing his pistol. So he's not immediately, incapacitated. But soon after, the two assassins basically make their escape on foot, and soon after Heydrich collapses, and he spends the next week basically with quite severe injuries from the shrapnel. His spleen is perforated. He's got basically a couple of broken ribs and a perforated lung, all from that piece of shrapnel. And what initially had looked like, fairly serious but survivable injuries basically developed into septicemia. And he died on the 4th of June, 1942 from septicemia, despite the attention of Hitler's best doctors. Quite a famous doctor called Ferdinand Sauerbruch, who was actually sent to Prague to try and save Heydrich's life, but unsuccessfully. So he actually succumbs to septicemia after a week of suffering. So that was the sort of happy ending of Operation Anthropoid. And then after that, it all kind of went wrong.
So talk to me about Hitler's reaction to Heydrich's assassination.
Yeah, Hitler had a sort of a soft spot for Heydrich. I think he saw him, he was a very, for Hitler, a very positive figure. I think because of his brutality, because of his drive, his dynamism, a lot of who Heydrich was appealed to Hitler on a very personal level. He almost viewed him like a sort of.
He looks the part, didn't he? I mean,
son.
he looks the parts, doesn't he, Heydrich? He looks like you're.
Yeah, I mean, his various nicknames. He was known as the Blonde Beast. Various. Which is a great.
Not in a good way.
That's a great nickname, the Butcher of Prague. Yeah, and Hitler himself referred to him as the man with the iron heart. and that he saw as a positive, right? I mean, that was a song of praise from Hitler.
If Hitler thinks your heart is made of iron, you are something else. My God.
Exactly. Hitler did privately criticize Heydrich for basically having lax security. He thought he was a fool to just have one driver and be riding around in an open top car. He thought that was ridiculous. But really, it was. I mean, the fact that Heydrich could do that for so long was tribute to the fact that the Czech lands were so quiescent at that point. So in a sense, that Heydrich was right to do that. In a way, he was justified in doing it until he wasn't.
So Hitler goes nuts, right? Both from obviously in two phases. Once when the assassination attempt happens, and then again when Heydrich actually dies. Talk us through his reaction and what he does.
Yeah, so there's a huge, Operation Dragnet really to, first of all, try and find the assassins or would-be assassins at the point where they didn't yet know, that Heydrich was going to die. So they sort of, bring in those members of the Czech resistance that the Gestapo knew about, for example, or suspected, and a lot of them are tortured and so on, and basically sort of track down the movements of Gabčík and Kubiš and where they've been, to some extent, where they've been in the previous 6 months. They actually eventually tracked down Gabčík and Kubiš, but that's a couple of weeks later. So in the meantime, there's various places that they go and basically do a sort of dragnet of the population, torture people, otherwise persuade people to speak to them. There's a particularly hideous moment later on where a young man who is involved, or his family are involved with the Czech resistance, is presented with the severed head of his mother in a bucket, and he's basically told, if you don't tell us where these guys are, then we'll do the same to your dad, which is quite persuasive. So this is sort of techniques that they're using. It's quite brutal. The most sort of headline act of that reprisal is that they discovered that Gabčík and Kubiš had contact, or a radio set was discovered, which was suspected they might have used in a small village outside Prague called Lidice. And a lot of our listeners, I'm sure, will know this, might even have been to Lidice, or what's left of it. So Lidice itself was then raided by the SS. 199 men were killed. 195 women were sent to the concentration camps. Just under 100 children were also sent to the camps. And they were actually screened to see how many of them could be Germanized, i.e. sort of adopted out to German families. So if they were sufficiently blonde-haired and blue-eyed, they would be sent out for adoption. Most of them weren't, so the vast majority were considered un-Germanizable and were just sent to the camps themselves as well. So there was a huge death toll from Lidice. Basically, the village itself was completely razed off the face of the earth. The ground sort of ploughed over, and all of this, really hideous. The same thing happened to a small village called Ležáky as well, which is often forgotten. But Lidice became the sort of headline act, and that became a real spur to, I suppose, anti-Nazi or anti-German sentiment around the world. There were, it appeared on stamps. It was in the news. It was, people named small villages after it in Midwest America and things like that. So Lidice was massive. Real taken as evidence, pure evidence of Nazi brutality, which it was.
I mean, as I understand it, the Nazis publicised it themselves as well, on the basis that this is what happens.
This is what happens. Yeah,
because of course, I mean,
encourager les autres.
Yeah, one of the things that I always find extraordinary about the entire project was the idea that they could perpetually hold so much territory that was hostile to their rule forever. And it was on a kind of colonialist principle, sure, but the colonies that it was emulating of the kind of Spanish, British type of the 19th century and onwards were always formed through kind of alliances and kind of, and co-opting the local elites and stuff. Yeah. This project of basically putting a lid on a place through terror in perpetuity seems to me to be an extraordinarily short-sighted and impossible to maintain project, war or no war.
Yeah, I mean, there were different occupation regimes in different territories, of course. It depended on your racial status. as to
Sure.
what regime you've got. So it was much more co-option and seduction in France, for example, or in Denmark. And then places like, the Czech lands or in Poland, it's much more just, brutality, like you say. Very often because, like in Poland, they couldn't really find anyone to collaborate with. So
Yeah.
it did that. There were those distinctions, but you're absolutely right. It basically, it was the boot stamping on the human face, to quote Orwell.
Right, exactly. And I just can't. I mean, obviously, it helps, I suppose, that I'm not a Nazi. I can't envisage
Jury's still
how
out on
you.
that one, Senior.
Yeah, I can't envisage how you could think it could work in a long-term sense. Like, you're just in a perpetual state of terrorizing.
Yeah.
I suppose, I mean, there are examples of it working in history, like the Spartans and the Helots or whatever. But I don't know.
I think to some extent as well, it's a byproduct of the ideology, which tells you that you're superior, you're innately superior to these people. Therefore, why should you collaborate with them? Right? They're just scum. They are people to be lorded over and ruled over. So there's no need to collaborate with them and find people to co-opt. You don't have to. So I think that partly explains why, depending on the racial status of the subject people, the occupation regime is very different.
Yeah, no, sure. So, but equally, they have to continue, like the nature of the occupation and the nature of the ideology is such that they are forced by the logic of it all to react incredibly badly to the assassination of Heydrich on there.
Yeah.
They absolutely have to do what they did by their own logic,
Yes.
which is escalate terror as a warning and as a reprisal.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same, you saw the same thing with the Polish acts. I mentioned the killing of Franz Kuchera in Warsaw in 1943. The German reaction to these actions is always, completely exaggerated because there's an element of how dare you here. You had to show your superiority. This cannot be allowed to stand, right?
Yeah.
One of their people, if you like, one of their senior people can be murdered by these subhumans is how they would view it. And they view it entirely through that lens. Therefore, the reaction was always going to be exaggerated. And another strand of this, incidentally, is that the murder of Heydrich, who, as I said, was, very senior in the SS, was, had chaired the Wannsee Conference, for example. What is essentially, I mean, I know it's kind of not, but for shorthand's sake, it's basically the planning meeting for the Holocaust earlier in 1942, in January 1942. The reaction by the Nazi authorities to his killing has a Jewish strand as well. So they basically, because they see every setback that they experience as evidence of this sort of hydra-headed Jewish conspiracy, right? This world conspiracy that's doing them down. So they even saw the murder of Heydrich ultimately as an expression of, their Jewish enemy. It's a victory for the Jews. If they suffer a defeat, it must be a victory for the Jews. This kind of twisted, binary viewpoint they have. And they're pulling Jews out of the concentration camps and shooting them out of hand. So thousands of Jews are actually killed. Who are completely innocent of any wrongdoing. They're utterly uninvolved in the Heydrich killing, but to the Nazi mind, it's all of a part, right? It's all part of the same thing. So, thousands of Jews are killed. The dragnet of the Czech resistance, again, draws in hundreds, if not thousands of people. So the estimate is that, in total, probably about 10,000 people were actually killed in the aftermath of Heydrich's murder, which is quite astonishing.
It's amazing. The Nazis were very good at reprisals during World War II, but is there a single...
Very good at reprisals, yeah.
Yeah. And
they specialised in it, yeah.
Yeah, and is this, 10,000 people for one man's life? Is this the biggest calculation of that
I think it probably is, yeah. I mean, it's very interesting that it was of such a magnitude that, later on in the war, 1944, you had what was known as Operation Foxley, which was, and there were also what they called the Little Foxleys. This was another SOE plan actually for assassinating Hitler, right? Foxley was going to be Hitler, and then the Little Foxleys was people like Himmler and Goebbels and others. So none of these ever went into operational. They were only sort of planning documents. But what was interesting in the gap between a planning document and an operational setting, there's lots of discussion about, well, should we do this? Like, is it first of all, sensible to do it? And one of the main considerations in all of those discussions later on about potential of killing Hitler was, look what the Germans did about Heydrich. That cannot be countenanced again. Like, there are thousands and thousands of people who would be killed as a result of an assassination attempt on Hitler, means that it's not worth it. So that it all fed into Allied thinking about assassination as a policy as well.
So, with this big dramatic act, the Czechs were hoping that there would be some reprisals which would stir up resistance, and obviously the Germans were hoping that with the scale of reprisals they would crush all resistance, and it turned out really to be the Germans that won that particular equation as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Czech resistance, such as it was basically as those that had sort of tried to confront Gabčík and Kubiš on this and said, you really don't want to do that, they were proved right. Czech resistance was basically crushed. It was fairly weak as it was, and it was basically crushed in the aftermath. Gabčík and Kubiš, incidentally, were chased down to a church in the middle of Prague, the Church of St. Cyril Methodius. And on the 18th of June, there was a standoff there. There was a tip-off through that sort of dragnet. There was a tip-off as to where they were hiding. They're hiding in the crypt with a couple of other members of the Czech resistance. There was a standoff. The SS tried to blast their way in. They were fought back. They tried to then flood them out by putting fire hoses into the crypt and so on. And eventually, in a firefight, all of the Czechs in the building, I think there were 5 of them at the end, including Gabčík and Kubiš, were killed. So that is still a site. If you ever go to Prague and sort of do the Heydrich tour, they don't call it that, but you can go to the Church of Cyril Methodius, and it's got it's absolutely riddled with bullet holes. It's an astonishing end. I mean, tremendously brave, because they were given, I wouldn't say the option to surrender, because I don't think it would have been honoured, but the SS was sort of trying to coax them out, and they said, no, we're not going to surrender, and they did fight to the death. So it's an amazingly heroic story.
Okay, so this is the question I'm going to put to you, Roger. Do you think it was worth it? And do you think conclusions about whether it's worth it are useful or just a kind of exercise in unreasonable hindsight? What do you think?
I think this is very similar to a lot of the discussions that you hear in Polish historian circles and in sort of popular discourse about things like the Warsaw Rising. In the one sense, at the time, and for those people involved directly, they sensed that they absolutely had to do this for strategic reasons, for sort of geopolitical reasons, and all the rest of it. And the death of those people in what they expected would be reprisals was considered part and parcel of that equation, and they considered it to be worth it. But the sheer scale of those reprisals, in retrospect, to the benefit of hindsight, you can look back and say, was it? What did it actually achieve? It didn't stir up the Czech resistance. It crushed the Czech resistance in this case.
Yeah.
So I always, the answer to those Polish discussions about the Warsaw Rising, I always say the Warsaw Rising, they had to go ahead with it. It was brutal in the aftermath, absolutely, but they had to go ahead with it. The Czech one, I think, given that, really not much was achieved. I mean, Heydrich was removed, but, I don't think he would have changed the course of the war, put it that way.
Yeah.
So in a sense, there's a sort of a cosmic, revenge there going on, which we can all sort of, applaud. But, his survival wouldn't actually have made any difference, I don't think. So I think it's much more questionable in the Czech example, and I'm not sure it was worth it. So, 10,000, the vast majority of whom completely innocent of any wrongdoing, even by Nazi standards, is I don't think is an acceptable price.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Okay, let's talk about books. So I'm a big fan, and I've probably recommended this book on History with Us before, but Resistance, The Underground War in Europe, 1939 to 1945, by Halik Kochanski. When was it out? A couple of years ago. Absolutely magisterial.
It is
huge.
It is brilliant, and won a prize in book. And,
it is a brilliant book because it not only is replete with every detail you could ever want about resistance. It's also very wise in all its conclusions about where it helped, where it didn't help. More crucially, it's quite clear-eyed and quite cynical almost about the utility of resistance, while also understanding its kind of wider kind of, moral and political echoes. So yeah,
And I think
brilliant book.
she comes out against this operation as well, doesn't she? She questions its utility.
I think she does question it, but she does also point out the fact that the staggering scale of the German reprisals was useful in kind of galvanizing anti-Nazi public
That's
opinion
true.
across the world,
And worldwide.
not just in the
And worldwide.
across the world. Yeah. And in the States as well, crucially, where obviously this is a period in which, the shouldn't we kind of, how far should we commit? What should we do? So it did have an impact on public opinion, definitely in the United States, which is important and useful.
That's very true.
So, but I mean, it's a horrible equation, isn't it? And analogous would be, certain terrorist groups in the Middle East using people as human shields precisely to get them killed in order to provoke a certain reaction in the world.
Yeah. Right. So yes, Halik Kochanski, absolutely brilliant book, as is, her book on Poland, incidentally, Eagle Unbound, also brilliant.
Eagle Unbound, brilliant book, yeah.
I would say there's one really standout work just on the assassination, on Operation Anthropoid, which is Callum MacDonald's The Killing of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich. Bit of a mouthful of a title, which came out in about 1990, something like that, early 90s. Nicely short, it's probably only about 200 pages. Really good, solid, tells the story really well. So that I would recommend. I would also there's a couple of biographies of Heydrich, which obviously cover this and his wider career. The best one, I think, is Robert Gervart, who is a academic. He's at, I think, Trinity Dublin. But his biography of Heydrich, which is called Hitler's Hangman, is excellent. Came out about, 5-10 years ago. So those two I would recommend. There is another excursion into this in historical fiction, isn't there, Senior?
Yeah, so there's a very celebrated book called HHHH by Laurence Binet, a Frenchman, Binet, I guess, because he's French. And it won the Prix de Goncourt. Oh, God, me stumbling all these French
Wow,
words.
you're doing so much foreign today.
I know. And as you know, it's not my forte. And so it's a kind of fictional version of it. And it is brilliant. It was his debut. It was rightly and justly celebrated. The slight issue with it, and the reason I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to you, Roger Morehouse, knowing your slightly straightforward taste in fiction, is that it's kind of very postmodern and kind of self-referential. So the author himself is in there as a sort of character grappling with his own concerns about writing the story and sort of having dreams about Heydrich, and then kind of like examining his own. So it's all very, very slightly annoying metafiction, but and I'm not really often a fan of slightly annoying metafiction, but in this case it's done really rather brilliantly, so I do recommend it. But steer clear if you're more of a kind of straightforward narrative person.
I think that would probably piss me off, I'll be honest.
Don't read it. Roger, just don't. Some listeners may want to read it. I strongly recommend it. For you, not so much.
The last one I would give you is, for those that like a film, Anthropoid. Came out 10 years ago, something like that. It tells it very well, I think. But it does have both Cillian Murphy and Jamie Dornan in the leads of Gabčík and Kubiš, which, for a lot of our female listeners and viewers, all three of them on a good day is almost like this is the dream ticket. Jamie Dornan and Cillian Murphy on screen together, being very sort of, surly and masculine and all of that, and ultimately paying the ultimate price. So, and it's actually a very good film, to be fair. So
listen, Morehouse, you wonder why we have no female listeners. I think you're just demonstrating why right there with your rather reductive idea of what women who are interested in history might be interested in historical films. Okay. Having said which, I might well get it out tonight.
Yeah, you see? On that note,
yeah, on we go. Thank you so much. Thanks, Roger. That was brilliant.
That's
Tour
good.
de force. See you next time.
See you soon.